We're now going to be talking about the ways in which contracts are incomplete. So trying to think about the characteristics of contracts that makes them incomplete. So the idea here is that many commodities transacted in modern economies are not homogeneous. So they're not light red winter wheat number 2. And these goods and services are things in which quality can vary. So thinking about that, we have the limited information in many of these markets. So we have, when we have limited information, we're going to have incomplete contracts for a variety of reasons. And this is because traders cannot easily verify quality. Or you can observe quality, but you cannot verify that quality in a court of law or when you take it to a third party, right? So the important thing here is it's both verifiable and kind of enforceable in some capacity. So let's think about this in a few seconds. But the main question we're going to try to answer here is what makes a contract complete in the first place? What are the characteristics of a contract that allows it to be complete? So here are a couple of ideas. Firstly, a contract is complete if it covers all the aspects of the exchange in which anyone affected by the exchange, not just those people engaging in exchange themselves, such as the buyer and seller, has an interest. So it could be that there's a buyer and seller and that they are affected in certain capacities by the exchange, but then if there's a negative external effect on someone else as a consequence of that exchange, then that negative external effect, that's not included in the exchange, and therefore the exchange would not be a complete contract. It would be incomplete because these people are imposing a negative external cost, an external cost or a negative external effect on other people. Right? So if those other people are not included in the consideration of the contract is incomplete. Okay, so that's one aspect. Next thing is it has to be enforceable, like I was saying earlier. What this means is that it has to be enforceable at close to zero costs to the exchanging parties. So the buyer, the seller, we have to be able to ensure that we can take our contract to the courts and the courts can verify that contract easily at zero cost to us in order to ensure that it can be enforced in a basic way. What I mean by this, right, is imagine I engage in exchange with you, you sell me a good, I then get home, open the good and realize, wait, I thought I was buying a much better quality good. I then tell you, you need to give me my money back. You say no. We then go to the courts and the courts say, well, you've got an enforceable contract. It's okay. Just do this quickly and it's fine. And they do that in basically zero time, no cost to you and me. I get compensated, you get the good back. If on the other hand, we try to go to court and it doesn't work out cheaply or easily, then that contract is going to be unenforceable. Right? It's going to be unenforceable at zero cost, and that's going to make the contract incomplete. And this happens in a variety of different circumstances. Now, to be sure, what we see is that many institutions try to come about to try and solve this enforceability issue. So, for example, if you buy a good from, say, Amazon, Amazon, even though it involves third parties buying and selling goods, so people who aren't necessarily affiliated with Amazon selling goods on the Amazon platform, Amazon often will facilitate the exchange process and has its internal mechanisms to ensure that you get compensated as a buyer if you maintain your reputation as a buyer too. If you repeatedly try to abuse the Amazon system and send back many, many, many goods, well, you're also going to be blacklisted and they're not going to allow you to engage in exchange on Amazon anymore. But it's just important for us to be aware of what it means to have a complete contract. One, you have to make sure that all the parties involved are covering all aspects of the contract, and two, enforceability of the contract at zero cost by the courts. Okay, now what this means that contract enforcement by courts or other third parties, we call this exogenous enforcement. And that's because the enforcers are not parties to the contracts themselves. They're outside of the exchange. So what I want to think of here is, once more, you sell me a good or I sell you a good, we engage in exchange. And then when we take our contract to the courts, if there's some problem within the contract, then that third party, that exogenous outside of the contract organization, is enforcing the aspects of the contract for us. That is exogenous enforcement. Now, This aspect of exogenous enforcement, this enforcement of the terms of the contract by courts or other third parties, that's a defining characteristic of complete contracts, especially when this can be done, as we said, at basically zero cost. Now, we're going to contrast that soon with what we call endogenous enforcement. Endogenous enforcement is when the contract's aspects are going to be enforced by people within the contract themselves. So exogenous outside the contract, endogenous within the contract. Okay, so complete and incomplete contracts share two features. What are those going to be? Firstly, mutual gain. A transaction is based on the mutual expectations of gain by all participants involved. So the reason I buy a good from you is because I expect to benefit from the use of that good. The reason you sell it to me is because you incurred some cost to produce it, but then you sell it to me at some profit. We're getting mutual gain when we engage in exchange. But there's also a conflict of interest here, right? For example, you would like to charge me as high a price as you can possibly get, given the costs that you've incurred, but I would like to pay as low a price as I can feasibly pay in order to get the maximum benefits that I would like to receive. There's a conflict of interest there as to what the price should be, right? And also as to what the underlying quality should be, because often quality for you is costly to provide to me. So those conflicts of interest, they're a really important aspect of thinking how contracts work. So, just a reminder there about exogenous enforcement of a contract. Now, the key difference here between complete and incomplete contracts is whether the division of gains is enforced by an external body. So like I said a second ago, the exogenous enforcement of a contract is an aspect of complete contracts. This is a key difference between complete and incomplete contracts. So what do we mean when there's endogenous enforcement of a contract? Do we think the contract is still complete when enforcement is endogenous? Now, as I've already hinted at, the answer to both of those is basically no. If the parties to the contract themselves are enforcing the aspects of or the characteristics of the contract, then it is typically the case that the contract is incomplete. If you, as a buyer of some good from me, are trying to enforce certain characteristics of a contract without involving courts of law, without involving some third party, then something is going on within that contract which makes the contract incomplete. So let's look at some examples of exchange where contracts are incomplete. Firstly, for example, owners of firms want managers to maximize the value of the owner's assets. So there's some owners of a firm, but then there are managers. The owners want the managers to maximize the value of the firm's assets. But managers have their own objectives. For example, they might like first-class travel. Maybe they like to have a really nice corner office. And often it's the case that managerial contracts fall very short of having an enforceable requirement to maximize the owner's wealth. So you've got some owner, the managers. It's very hard for the owners to enforce contracts on the managers to maximize the owner's wealth themselves. Now here what we want to think about is what's the mutual gain, what's the conflict of interest, and why do we think the contract is incomplete? So I'm not going to answer those questions for you right now. I want you to try and think, what are the key answers to those questions which go back to the characteristics we spoke about earlier? There has to be mutual gain from exchange. Then we have to think about what the conflict of interest might be. And then we have to think about what makes this contract incomplete. So go back, check, and try and answer these questions yourselves. I'm going to give you another example. So another example is that families devote a sizable fraction of their budgets to purchasing educational services for their children. Now, the quality of those services is rarely specified in the contract. And it's basically going to be unenforceable even if we tried to put those aspects into a contract. So think about yourselves as students at a university or a college. Did you sign a contract when you paid for your college education or your university education saying, I am going to be provided levels of quality of education and of teaching that meet a certain level? Probably not, right? Now there you still want to think about what the mutual gain is in the interaction. What's going on with universities, with students, with parents, such that there's mutual gain in some exchange between the parties. What's going to be the conflict of interest between the parties involved too, and why do we think the contract might be incomplete? go back to, again, the characteristics we spoke about previously and see if you can apply them to these questions. What's the mutual gain? What's the conflict of interest? Why is the contract incomplete? Again, I am not going to answer those questions. I want you to try and answer them yourselves and just see how those might be applied to this question. Also, have a look at the textbook if you want some hints.